Don't put it back on. Zoraida didn't whisper it. She threw the words like a punch. She stood in the center of the Obsidian Tower's penthouse, a smudge of charcoal on her cheek and a plastic spray bottle clipped to her waist. To the men in the room, men who traded in oil, bone, and ammunition, she was as significant as the dust she had been hired to clean. But as she stepped toward Quan Ho, the ghost of the Midwest, the air in the room curdled. Quan Ho paused, his hand hovering over the Patek Philippe perpetual calendar resting on the mahogany table. It was a masterpiece of gold and silent gears, a 10-year anniversary gift from his second-in-command, Dae-hyun. "You're talking to me?" Quan Ho's voice was a low, surgical rasp. He didn't look up. He didn't have to. The power dynamic in the room was so absolute that a maid speaking to him was a glitch in reality. "I'm talking to the man who's about to have a hole blown through his chest," Zoraida said. Her South Side accent was thick, unpolished, and vibrating with a terrifying certainty. "Before we see who pulled the trigger, comment below with where you're watching from. If you love high-stakes drama, stick around and subscribe to Black X Korean Mafia boss stories to see how this survival story unfolds." The peace summit came to a grinding halt. The Detroit delegates reached for their jackets, their eyes darting between the girl in the gray uniform and the stone-faced Mafia boss. Quan Ho finally looked at her. He expected to see madness or the frantic heat of an assassin. Instead, he saw a reflection of a survival instinct he hadn't seen since his days in the slums of Seoul. She wasn't looking at his face, she was looking at the watch. "It's not ticking," she said, stepping closer. "Gold and gears don't hum, Quan Ho. But that thing on the table is singing." Dae-hyun stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of a ceramic blade tucked into his belt. "She's a replacement, Hyung. Delusional. I'll have security remove her," quietly. "Wait," Quan Ho commanded. He leaned in. He heard it then. Not the rhythmic heartbeat of a Swiss movement, but a microscopic, high-frequency pulse. It was the sound of a beacon searching for a satellite. Zoraida didn't wait for his permission. She lunged. The room exploded. Dae-hyun drew his weapon, but Zoraida was already a blur of gray fabric. She snatched the $100,000 watch before Quan Ho's fingers could touch it. The metal was unnaturally hot, searing her palm. "Drop it." Dae-hyun roared, the muzzle of his Glock aimed at Zoraida's forehead. She didn't drop it. She spun toward the industrial kitchen sink and hurled the watch into the basin. In one fluid motion, she grabbed a gallon of industrial bleach from her cleaning cart and poured it directly over the gold casing. Hiss! A plume of acrid, white smoke erupted. The digital scream of short-circuiting electronics filled the penthouse, a sound so sharp it made the men's ears bleed. Then the world turned to white noise. The floor-to-ceiling windows, designed to withstand the weight of a skyscraper's sway, disintegrated. A heavy-caliber sniper round tore through the vacuum where Quan Ho's head had been resting a split second prior. The force of the shot shattered the mahogany table into 1,000 splinters. Because Zoraida had tackled him toward the sink, shifting his profile by a mere 4 inches, the ghost was still breathing. Quan Ho hit the floor, glass diamonds embedding in his palms. He didn't look at the sniper's nest across the street. He looked at Dae-hyun. His brother wasn't ducking. He wasn't calling for the guards. He was standing in the center of the glass-strewn ruin, his face a mask of cold, calculated disappointment. The watch hadn't been a gift of loyalty. It was a laser-guided painting device. A beacon for a drone strike that would have turned the Obsidian Tower into a tomb. "The service elevator is the only one not on the main grid," Zoraida choked out, dragging Quan Ho by his lapels. Her face was peppered with tiny cuts from the glass, but her grip was iron. "If we stay here, the next round isn't going to miss." Quan Ho looked at his hands, the blood, the glass, the loss of everything he had built. He looked at the woman who had just committed treason against the underworld to save a man she was supposed to fear. "Why?" he rasped. "Because I'm not finished with you yet," she snapped, shoving him toward the back exit as the first of the council's hitmen breached the doors. The ghost of the Midwest didn't run. He descended. And as the steel doors of the freight elevator hissed shut, he realized he wasn't just escaping a hit, He was entering a war where the only person he could trust was the woman who had just destroyed his life to save it. 48 hours before the glass shattered, the worlds of Kwanho and Zoraida were two parallel lines that should never have touched. Kwanho lived his life by the sweep of a second hand. His morning began at 4:30 a.m. in a sensory deprivation tank, floating in salt water that mimicked the void. He was a man of absolute precision. When he stepped out, his tailor was waiting with a suit of charcoal silk, stitched by hand in a basement in Milan. To the Chicago underworld, Kwanho was a ghost. He didn't use drugs, he didn't drink to excess, he didn't have a family to be used as leverage. His only addiction was order. His office in the Obsidian Tower was a temple of minimalism. No paper, no clutter, only a single monitor that tracked the flow of invisible cargo, fentanyl from the ports, high-grade steel from the mills, and the politicians who kept the gears greased. The Detroit faction is restless, Hyung. Dae-hyun had said that Monday, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows. Kwanho hadn't looked up from his screen. Restlessness is a symptom of poor leadership. We will give them a peace summit. We will give them the illusion of a partnership. And then, we will remind them why the Midwest belongs to us. Dae-hyun had smiled, that thin, oily smile that Kwanho now realized was a mask for a predator. I have a gift for the occasion. The Patek Philippe. Perpetual. Just like your reign. Kwanho had accepted it without a second thought. It was a logical gesture from a loyal lieutenant. He hadn't noticed that the weight was off by a fraction of a gram. He hadn't noticed the faint, metallic scent of ozone emanating from the casing. He was too busy calculating the future to see the trap sitting on his own wrist. Betrayal hurts most when it's family. Have you ever been backstabbed? Tell us your story and hit subscribe to Black X Korean Mafia Boss Stories for more tales of loyalty and lies. 6 floors below the penthouse, Zoraida was living a different kind of precision. Her life was measured in bus schedules and the ticking of a cracked alarm clock. She lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on the south side where the heat only worked if you kicked the radiator in a specific spot. Her precision was survival. You're late, Z. The shift supervisor hissed as Zoraida stepped into the service entrance of the Obsidian Tower. The 29 bus was held up by a shooting on 63rd, Zoraida replied, her voice flat. She didn't offer excuses because excuses didn't pay the bills. She grabbed her cart, the plastic wheels squeaking against the polished granite. Zoraida wasn't supposed to be on the penthouse floor. She was a floater, filling in for a woman named Maria who had disappeared 3 days prior. The syndicate told the agency Maria had moved back to Mexico. Zoraida, who had seen the bloodstains on the service elevator carpet that morning, knew better. She wasn't there to clean. She was there to watch. Every time Zoraida entered a room, she mapped it. She knew where the exits were. She knew which floorboards creaked. She knew that the ghost liked his scotch with exactly 2 cubes of clear ice and that his most loyal brother, Dae-hyun, had a nervous habit of adjusting his cufflinks whenever he lied. She spent her lunch break in the stairwell, eating a cold sandwich and looking at a photo on her phone. It was a young man in a graduation gown, grinning at the camera. Marcus. Her brother. The world thought he was in law school. Zoraida let them think that. It was safer than the truth. The truth was that Marcus was buried in a cemetery where the grass didn't grow, killed by a business deal gone wrong 3 years ago. A deal authorized by a man who wore charcoal silk suits and lived in a glass tower. Zoraida didn't want money. She didn't even want a confession. She wanted the ledger. She had spent months working 3 jobs, maneuvering through cleaning agencies, and scrubbing the toilets of monsters just to get within striking distance of the Obsidian Tower's internal server. On that Tuesday morning, as she polished the marble countertops in the adjacent kitchen, she saw the delivery boy. He was wearing a standard uniform, carrying a package for Dae-hyun. But he wasn't looking at the floor like a delivery person. He was scanning the ceiling for cameras. And when he handed the box to Dae-hyun, Zoraida saw the way he adjusted his glove. It was a tactical adjustment, one meant to ensure no fingerprints were left on a high-tech device. She watched Dae-hyun open the box and pull out the gold watch. She saw him press a small, hidden indentation on the side of the casing before handing it to Kwanho. The watch didn't start ticking. Zoraida's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew that sound. In the South Side, you learn the difference between a mechanical tick and an electronic hum. One was a timepiece. The other was a trigger. She looked at Kwanho. He was a monster, a man who had indirectly erased her brother from the world. But if he died now, the ledger died with him. Dae-hyun would burn everything to hide his tracks, and Marcus would never have justice. She had to keep the monster alive long enough to make him pay. "Peace," Kwanho said to the Detroit men, raising his glass. Zoraida gripped the handle of her bleach bottle. The air in the room suddenly felt heavy, like the atmosphere before a lightning strike. She looked at the watch on Kwanho's wrist. It was glowing, a faint, infrared pulse that only someone looking for a signal would see. The parallel lines were about to collide. The Maid and the Mafia boss were about to become the only two people left in a world that wanted them both dead. While the penthouse of the Obsidian Tower was a shrine to glass and light, the underworld beneath it was a kingdom of grease and cold concrete. 3 hours before the sniper's bullet shattered the peace, Dae-hyun stood in the bowels of a derelict parking garage near the Chicago River. He wasn't alone. Shadows shifted at the edge of the flickering sodium lights. 3 men from the Detroit faction, the very men who would later sit across from Kwanho at the mahogany table, emerged from a blacked-out SUV. They didn't look like diplomats. They looked like vultures waiting for a carcass to stop twitching. "Is it done?" the lead Detroiter asked, his voice echoing against the damp walls. Dae-hyun didn't answer immediately. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted tablet. On the screen, a single green dot pulsed. It was the signal from the Patek Philippe, currently sitting in its velvet-lined box in the penthouse. "The beacon is active," Dae-hyun said. He looked at the dot with a mixture of reverence and resentment. The ghost thinks it's a tribute. He thinks his legacy is so absolute that his brothers would rather gift him gold than lead. "The council is impatient," the Detroiter growled. "Kwanho is too surgical. He's too quiet. He's bad for business. People want a boss who bleeds, not a ghost who manages spreadsheets." Dae-hyun's eyes hardened. Kwanho isn't just a manager. He's a relic. He believes in the old codes, precision, loyalty, silence. But the world has moved on. We don't need a scalpel anymore. We need a hammer. The hunter is now the prey. Can a mafia boss survive without his throne? Subscribe to Black X Korean Mafia Boss Stories so you don't miss the next move. The betrayal had been months in the making. It wasn't born from a single grudge, but from 1,000 small humiliations. Dae-hyun had been the loyal brother. For a decade, the man who cleaned up the blood so Kwanho's hands stayed white. He had stood in the shadow of the Obsidian Tower for long enough. He had gone to the council, the shadowy board of elders who oversaw the national syndicate, with a proposition. If they removed Kwanho, Dae-hyun would double the kickbacks and open the Chicago ports to the new, more aggressive chemicals coming out of the east. The council agreed. But they didn't want a messy street war. They wanted a surgical removal. "The drone is in position," the Detroiter said, tapping his earpiece. "It's high altitude. No sound, no radar signature. Once that watch stays stationary for more than 60 seconds at the coordinates, the missile locks on. The thermobaric charge will vaporize the top 3 floors. No bodies, no evidence. Just a gas leak in the city's most expensive building." "And the staff?" Dae-hyun asked, though his voice lacked any real concern. "Collateral damage. Including your cleaning girl." Dae-hyun shrugged. "A replacement. No one will miss her." He climbed back into his vehicle, the tablet glowing in his lap. He drove back to the Obsidian Tower, passing the very buses that carried women like Zoraida to their shifts. He felt a surge of godlike power. He was the one holding the remote to the ghost's life. Back in the penthouse, Dae-hyun had entered Kwanho's office with the gift. He had watched Kwanho's face, the rare, subtle softening of the ghost's features as he looked at the gold timepiece. 10 years, Kwanho had said, his thumb tracing the bezel. "You've been a steady hand, Dae-hyun." "I learned from the best, Hyung," Dae-hyun replied, the lie tasting like copper in his mouth. He had stayed for the meeting, sitting to Kwanho's right, the place of highest honor. He watched the Detroit men arrive, knowing they were counting down the minutes. Every time Kwan Ho checked the time on that watch, he was checking the countdown to his own execution. But Dae Hyun hadn't accounted for the invisible world. He hadn't accounted for the woman in the gray uniform who was currently scrubbing the backsplash in the kitchen. He had looked at Zoraida a dozen times that morning and seen nothing but a tool. He didn't see the way her eyes tracked the delivery boy. He didn't see the way she noticed the lack of a ticking sound. As the meeting progressed, Dae Hyun's heart began to race. He was waiting for the drone to signal lock-on. He saw Kwan Ho reach for his scotch. He saw the hand tremor. He thought it was fear. He thought the ghost finally knew the end was coming. Then the girl moved. Dae Hyun watched in a split second of frozen horror as the maid, the nobody, lunged across the table. When she snatched the watch, his first instinct wasn't to protect Kwan Ho, it was to protect the signal. "Drop it," he had screamed, not out of loyalty to the ghost, but because if that beacon moved, the drone would lose its lock. When the watch hit the bleach, Dae Hyun felt his future evaporating. The high-pitched electronic scream of the short-circuiting transponder was the sound of his plan dying. The sniper round that followed was a backup, a desperate Plan B, triggered by the drone's automated system when the primary lock failed. It was supposed to be a clean vaporization. Now, it was a messy public assassination attempt. As the glass rained down and the penthouse became a war zone, Dae Hyun stood in the center of the ruin. He wasn't a brother anymore. He was a traitor whose mask had been ripped off. He looked at the back of the freight elevator where Kwan Ho and the girl were disappearing. He didn't need the drone anymore. He had an entire city's worth of soldiers, and he had the keys to every door in the obsidian tower. "They haven't left the building," Dae Hyun said into his radio, his voice now a cold, dead rasp. "Lock down the garage. Seal the exits. If they breathe, kill them. If they move, burn them. I want the ghost's head, and I want the girl's tongue." The Judas kiss was over. The hunt for the ghost had begun. The freight elevator plummeted. It wasn't the smooth, silent glide of the executive lifts. It was a bone-jarring drop through the dark, grease-slicked throat of the obsidian tower. Inside, the only light came from the glowing red, emergency, button and the frantic, rhythmic spark of the short-circuiting control panel. Kwan Ho slammed against the steel wall, his hand pressed against a jagged gash in his side. The charcoal silk of his suit was now a sodden rag of black and crimson. Beside him, Zoraida stood with her feet braced, her eyes fixed on the floor indicator. She wasn't shaking. "The garage is a kill zone," she said, her voice cutting through the mechanical groan of the cables. "Dae Hyun owns the security team. They'll be waiting at the sub-basement with every gun in the building." Kwan Ho looked at her. Really looked at her. In the dim red light, she looked less like a maid and more like a ghost herself, shadowy, sharp, and cold. "You've spent too much time studying my floor plans, girl. Who are you working for? Detroit? The council? I'm working for a dead boy who deserved better than a stray bullet in a parking lot." Zoraida snapped, finally turning to face him. Her eyes were pools of molten iron. "And right now, I'm the only reason you aren't a smear on that mahogany table. So shut up and move when I say move." Is she saving him or selling him? The mystery deepens. Tap that subscribe button on Black ex-Korean Mafia boss stories to find out Zoraida's true motive. The elevator screeched to a halt, not at the garage, but 2 floors above it. Zoraida jammed a screwdriver into the door sensor, forcing the heavy steel to groan open. They stepped out into the loading bay. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and stale exhaust. "Why here?" Kwan Ho rasped, his breath hitching. "Because they expect you to take the armored Mercedes in the private bay," she said, pulling him toward a row of nondescript service vehicles. "They've already got the GPS tracked on those. We need something invisible." She stopped in front of a battered, tan Ford Taurus. It was covered in a layer of city salt and had a baby on board, sticker peeling off the rear window. It was the most unremarkable object in the city of Chicago. "You expect me to ride in this?" Kwan Ho asked, a flicker of his old arrogance returning. "I expect you to survive," Zoraida retorted. She didn't use a key. She pulled a wire from under the steering column, and with a shower of sparks, the engine turned over with a rough, coughing idle. "Get in. Stay low." As they rolled toward the exit, the roar of black SUVs filled the ramp below. Daehyun's hitmen were swarming the sub-basement, their submachine guns raised, their tactical lights cutting through the gloom. They blew the doors off the private garage, shattering the windows of Kwon-ho's $300,000 Maybach, expecting to find the ghost cowering inside. They never looked at the tan Ford Taurus crawling past the security gate. The 4-inch difference wasn't just about the sniper's bullet. It was about the gap between the world Kwon-ho built and the world Zoraida inhabited. In his world, power was loud, expensive, and visible. In hers, power was the ability to vanish in plain sight. Once they hit the Dan Ryan Expressway, the neon lights of the skyline began to retreat in the rearview mirror. The glass crown of the obsidian tower looked like a jagged tooth against the bruising purple of the twilight sky. "We need to get to the outskirts," Zoraida said, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "The council has eyes on the tolls and the airports. We stay on the back roads. We head south." Kwon-ho leaned his head against the cracked vinyl headrest. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by the cold, hollow ache of betrayal. He had spent 20 years building an empire, selecting every brick and every man with surgical precision. And in 10 minutes, it had all turned to ash. "Daehyun was my brother," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "I gave him everything." "You gave him a throne to covet," Zoraida said, her voice softening just a fraction. "In your world, there are no brothers. Just rivals you haven't killed yet." She pushed the Taurus to 80, the frame of the old car vibrating as they crossed the city limits. Behind them, the towers of Chicago blurred into a smear of light. They weren't just leaving the city, they were leaving the grid. For the next 3 hours, they drove in a silence heavy with unspoken questions. Kwon-ho watched the cornfields of Illinois swallow the road. The darkness here was different than the darkness of the city. It was vast, indifferent, and hungry. "Where are we going?" he finally asked. "A place where a ghost can hide," she replied. "A place where no one looks for a man in a silk suit." They pulled into a gravel lot of a dilapidated motel just outside of Indianapolis. The sign flickered with a dying buzz, "The Sleepy Willow." It smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. Zoraida turned off the engine. The silence that followed was deafening. She turned to Kwon-ho, her face illuminated by the flickering neon of the motel sign. "This is step 1, she said. "Tomorrow I teach you how to be a nobody. If you want to get your revenge, you have to learn how to disappear first." Kwon-ho looked at his hands. The blood had dried, turning his palms into a map of dark, cracked lines. He was stripped of his suits, his guards, and his watch. He was a man with nothing, being led by a woman he had never noticed until she saved his life. The 4-inch difference had saved his body. Now, he had to see if it could save his soul. The morning at the Sleepy Willow didn't arrive with the soft chime of a smart home system or the smell of freshly roasted Kona coffee. It arrived with the smell of moldy drywall and the roar of a semi-truck downshifting on the nearby highway. Kwon-ho awoke on a mattress that sagged like a hammock. He was still wearing the trousers of his charcoal suit, but the silk was ruined, stained with the salt of 1,000 miles and the copper of his own blood. He looked at the ceiling, watching a single water spot expand. For a moment, he reached for his wrist to check the time. There was nothing but a pale, untanned strip of skin where the Patek Philippe used to be. The ghost of the Midwest was out of time. "Drink this," Zoraida said. She was standing by the window, peeking through a gap in the heavy, nicotine-stained curtains. She tossed a plastic foam cup onto the bedside table. "It's gas station coffee. It'll taste like battery acid, but it'll stop the shakes." Kwon-ho sat up, his body screaming in protest. He took a sip. It was bitter, scalding, and perfect. "Where did you get the clothes?" he asked, nodding toward a pile of denim and cotton sitting at the foot of the bed. "Thrift store Dropbox down the road," she said, her voice flat. "That suit you're wearing is a beacon. In this town, anyone wearing silk is either a federal agent or a corpse. Put on the flannels. You need to look like a man who works with his back, not his phone. Redemption or revenge? What would you choose? Make sure you're subscribed to Black X Korean Mafia Boss Stories for the final showdown." The transformation was visceral. Kwan Ho stripped away the layers of his old life. He put on a pair of stiff, unwashed jeans and a plaid work shirt that smelled of someone else's laundry detergent. He looked in the cracked mirror above the vanity. The man staring back wasn't a boss. He was a ghost of a different kind, a drifter, a shadow among the millions of invisible people he had spent his life ignoring. Now, Zoraida said, grabbing her car keys. Lesson 1. We're going to the laundromat. The laundromat? Kwan Ho's brow furrowed. I have more pressing concerns. I need to contact my associates in New York. I need to secure my offshore accounts. Your associates are likely the ones who paid for the drone, and your accounts are being monitored by the FBI and Daehyun's hackers. Zoraida retorted, opening the door. Right now, you're not a boss. You're a guy who needs to wash his socks. If you can't handle a laundromat without looking like a predator, you won't last 48 hours on the road. The next 2 weeks were a grueling immersion into the invisible world. Zoraida was a relentless teacher. She showed him how to sit in a diner without scanning the exits every 5 seconds, because regular people don't expect to be shot over breakfast. She taught him the poor man's walk, shoulders slumped, eyes down, moving with the heavy gait of someone who is tired rather than the predatory glide of a man who owns the pavement. At a local laundromat, she sat him down in a plastic chair next to an elderly woman knitting a sweater. Look at her, Zoraida whispered. What do you see? An old woman, Kwan Ho replied, bored. No, Zoraida said. You see a witness. If you sit there looking like you're calculating the price of the machines, she'll remember you. If you sit there and ask her how her grandson is doing, you become part of the background noise. People don't remember the help, Kwan Ho. They remember the people who make them feel seen. Use that. Kwan Ho felt a strange, uncomfortable shift in his chest. For 20 years, his power had come from being feared. Now, his survival depended on being liked, or at least being unremarkable. One evening, they sat on the tailgate of the Ford Taurus, watching the sun sink behind a line of rusted silos. The air was cool, smelling of cut hay. You're good at this, Kwan Ho said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. The hiding. The blending. Where did a cleaning girl learn to be a ghost? Zoraida stared at the horizon, her jaw tight. When you grow up where I grew up, you learn that the police only see what they want to see, and the gangs only see what they can use. If you want to keep your head down and your family safe, you learn to be heir. You learn to be the person who mops the floor while the kings talk, because the kings never think the floor has ears. Is that how you knew about the watch? I saw the delivery boy's shoes, she said simply. Nobody delivers a package in $400 tactical boots unless they're expecting a fight. And Daehyun. He looked at that watch like it was a detonator, not a gift. Kwan Ho looked at her profile. She was a woman who had lost everything to the world he created, yet here she was, keeping him alive. He felt a surge of something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite guilt. It was a realization that the nobodies were the ones truly running the world. They were the ones who saw the cracks in the armor. As the days turned into weeks, Kwan Ho's surgical precision began to adapt. He stopped reaching for a watch that wasn't there. He started noticing the way the waitress at the diner always gave the truckers extra coffee, and how the local sheriff always stopped for a donut at 7:15 a.m. He was learning to map a new kind of territory. But the peace was an illusion. Underneath the flannel and the denim, the wolf was still there. Every night, while Zoraida slept, Kwan Ho would sit in the dark, practicing the draw of his compact pistol, his eyes cold and focused. He was learning to be invisible, yes, but only so he could get close enough to strike. The emotional conflict deepened when he realized he was starting to trust her. Truly trust her. It was a sensation more terrifying than the sniper round. However, that trust shattered on the 14th night. Kwan Ho had stepped out to clear his head when he saw the light of a cell phone reflecting in the window of the motel's laundry room. It was Zoraida. She was hunched over, her voice a frantic whisper. I have him, she was saying. He's changed. He's starting to drop his guard. Just tell me when the extraction team is ready. I want this over with. I want the deal we discussed. Kwan Ho felt the old, cold vacuum return to his soul. He didn't feel anger. He felt a familiar, hollow disappointment. He had been a fool to think nobody wouldn't have a price. He stepped into the room, the door creaking on its rusted hinges. Zoraida jumped, nearly dropping the phone. The moonlight caught the silver of the device, a burner phone he hadn't known she had. "Who are you talking to, Zoraida?" he asked, his voice returning to the low, terrifying rasp of the ghost. "Is it Daehyun? Did you save me just to sell me for a higher price?" Zoraida looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't look like a maid. She looked like a predator who had finally caught its prey. She didn't hide the phone. She turned the screen toward him. The number on the screen wasn't a Chicago area code. It was a direct line to a federal building in St. Louis. "I'm not selling you to the Mafia, Kwon-ho," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of pity and iron. "I'm selling you to the truth." The air in the laundry room was thick with the scent of cheap bleach and betrayal. It was a smell Kwon-ho knew better than his own name. He stood in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the only exit, the flannel shirt he wore feeling like a costume that had finally been ripped away. "The FBI?" Kwon-ho's voice was a dead thing. "You've been grooming me for a witness box?" Zoraida didn't flinch. She tucked the burner phone into her pocket and stepped closer to the flickering fluorescent light. "I've been grooming you to survive. But I'm not doing it for your sake. I'm doing it for a boy named Marcus." "Who?" "Exactly," she spat. "He was 19. He was a student. He was working a summer job at the docks you control in Gary, Indiana. He saw a shipment of medical supplies that turned out to be enough fentanyl to kill half the state. He didn't know the rules, Kwon-ho. He didn't know that in your world, seeing is a death sentence." Kwon-ho searched his memory. He saw thousands of shipments, hundreds of ledger entries, and dozens of disposal orders. But he didn't see a boy. To a king, the ants are all the same color. "I didn't kill your brother," he said, his tone shifting back to the surgical coldness of the ghost. "You signed the order that made his death a line item," Zoraida countered. "Daehyun's men did the work, but it was your order that built the machine. I spent 3 years getting close to you. I took the job at the agency, I worked the late shifts, I watched your patterns. I didn't save you in the penthouse because I care about your life. I saved you because if you died there, the council would have wiped the servers, and Marcus's killers would have become the new kings. The truth is out. Is Zoraida a hero or just another player in a deadly game? Drop your theories below and subscribe to Black X Korean Mafia Boss Stories for the finale." She sat on a vibrating washing machine, her hands shaking slightly. "The FBI doesn't want your head on a spike, Kwon-ho. They want the ledger. The real one. The digital one you keep encrypted on a server that only responds to your biometric signature. They've promised me a new life, a real witness protection program for my mother, and the chance to see Daehyun rot in a cage." "And what do they offer me?" Kwon-ho asked, a cruel smile touching his lips. "A life in a concrete box? A reduced sentence in exchange for my soul? They offer you a chance to take Daehyun down with you," she whispered. "Is that not what you want? Revenge?" Kwon-ho walked toward her, his footsteps heavy on the linoleum. He didn't reach for his gun. He reached for the phone. "The FBI is a bureaucracy, Zoraida. They move with the speed of a glacier. By the time they extract us, Daehyun will have finished his purge. He'll have the council's full backing, and he'll have erased every trace of your brother and you." He looked at the burner phone. "Who is your contact?" "Agent Miller. St. Louis field office." "Miller is a ghost," Kwon-ho said, his eyes narrowing. "I've had him on my payroll for 5 years." The color drained from Zoraida's face. She looked at the phone as if it were a poisonous snake. "No," he said. "He said he wanted to clean up the city." "He wants to clean up the competition," Kwon-ho corrected. "If you lead him to us, he won't be bringing an extraction team. He'll be bringing a cleanup crew to finish what the sniper started. He works for the council now. Why do you think the drone had the coordinates so fast?" The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of her mistake. Zoraida sank onto the machine, the reality of her 3-year gamble collapsing around her. She had been playing a game of chess against grandmasters, and she had just handed them her king. "We have to move," Quan Ho said, his voice regaining the authority of the obsidian tower. If you called him 10 minutes ago, they're already tracking the tower pings. They'll be here within the hour. I thought I was doing the right thing, she whispered, her voice cracking. Quan Ho grabbed her by the shoulders. He didn't do it with anger, but with a sudden, jarring intensity. Listen to me. In the invisible world, there is no right. There is only the move that keeps you alive. You wanted the truth for Marcus? The truth is in a vault in St. Louis. Not with the FBI, but in a private terminal I built as a failsafe. He pulled her toward the door. We're not going to your extraction. We're going to the heart of the machine. I'm going to give you your ledger, Zoraida. But first, you're going to help me burn the obsidian tower to the ground. They ran for the Ford Taurus. The night air was no longer cool and peaceful. It felt charged with the electricity of an approaching storm. As Zoraida jammed the car into gear, Quan Ho saw a pair of headlights turn onto the gravel road leading to the motel. They were high-intensity LEDs, the kind used by government SUVs and high-end security details. Don't look back, Quan Ho commanded. Drive toward the river. If they want the ghost, we'll give them a haunting they'll never forget. As they tore out of the parking lot, the black SUV didn't follow immediately. It stopped at the laundry room. A man stepped out, not in a uniform, but in a charcoal silk suit that was a perfect replica of the one Quan Ho had discarded. Dae-hyun was no longer waiting for the drone. He had come to do the work himself. He's here, Zoraida gasped, seeing the silhouette in the side mirror. I know, Quan Ho said, his hand finally resting on the cold steel of his hidden pistol. It's time to stop hiding. A ghost only has power when people are afraid of the dark. It's time to turn on the lights. They headed south, toward the secret of St. Louis, with the traitor at their heels and the weight of a dead boy's justice sitting between them like a loaded gun. The 7,000-word journey was reaching its boiling point, and only one of them was intended to walk away from the flame. St. Louis rose from the riverbank like a city of rust and secrets. The gateway to the west was supposed to be a symbol of expansion, but for Quan Ho and Zoraida, it was a funnel. They were being squeezed toward the river, toward a nondescript data center buried beneath an old sugar refinery. The Ford Taurus was steaming, its radiator punctured by a stray round 3 miles back. Zoraida steered the dying car into the shadows of the refinery, the engine giving one final, metallic wheeze before seizing. The terminal is in the basement, Quan Ho said, his voice a steady, rhythmic pulse. He wasn't the man in the plaid shirt anymore. He had shed that skin. He moved with the quiet, lethal grace of a predator returning to its den. Once I log in, the ledger begins a global upload. Every bribe, every murder, every shipment. It doesn't go to the FBI. It goes to the public. To the news. To the street. You'll go down too, Zoraida said, her hand tight on the screwdriver she still carried. The ghost was already dead, he replied. A legend is harder to kill than a man. They breached the heavy steel doors of the data center. The air inside was chilled to a constant $65°/F, humming with the sound of 1,000 cooling fans. In the center of the room sat a single, sleek terminal. Quan Ho stepped toward it. He placed his hand on the biometric glass. Verify. The screen bloomed into life, a waterfall of data cascading in emerald light. Step away from the console, Hyung. The voice was like a ghost of the obsidian tower. Dae-hyun stood at the entrance, his charcoal suit pristine, his weapon raised with the practiced ease of a man who had done this 1,000 times in his dreams. Behind him stood 4 men, the council's cleaners. Quan Ho didn't turn around. You're late, Dae-hyun. The upload is at 40%. Then I'll kill you at 41, Dae-hyun said, his eyes scanning the room for Zoraida. And the girl? She was a clever distraction. But in the end, she's just more glass in the way of the view. The end is here. Did the ghost win, or did the shadow fall? Tell us your thoughts on this ending in the comments and subscribe to Black X Korean Mafia Boss Stories for the next series. Zoraida moved. She didn't lunge at Dae-hyun. She lunged at the cooling system's main valve. With a violent wrench, she tore the emergency release. A cloud of liquid nitrogen gas hissed into the room, turning the floor into a sea of white fog. "Now!" she screamed. Gunfire erupted. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, the rounds ricocheting off the server racks like angry hornets. Quan Ho dived behind the terminal, his own silver pistol barking twice. One cleaner went down, a crimson star blooming on his forehead. In the confusion of the fog, the invisible world took over. Zoraida moved through the white cloud like a wraith. She knew how to move in the dark. She had spent her life in the corners of rooms. She appeared behind the second cleaner, her screwdriver finding the soft spot beneath his jaw. He fell without a sound. Quan Ho and Dae-hyun locked eyes across the glowing terminal. This wasn't about the ledger anymore. It was about the 10 years of lies. "You thought I was weak because I chose order over blood," Quan Ho rasped, firing until his slide locked back. "I thought you were weak because you forgot what it's like to be hungry." Dae-hyun roared, charging through the fog. They collided in a blur of silk and steel. Dae-hyun was younger, faster, fueled by a decade of resentment. He pinned Quan Ho against the server rack, his hands closing around the older man's throat. "The council doesn't want a ghost," Dae-hyun hissed. "They want a king." "Then let them have one," Quan Ho gasped. He reached up, but he didn't go for Dae-hyun's eyes. He went for the watch. Dae-hyun was wearing it now, the Patek Philippe, repaired and polished. The symbol of the throne. Quan Ho jammed his thumb into the bezel, triggering the manual override he had built into the failsafe years ago. The watch didn't hum this time. It let out a sharp, electronic chirp. High above the refinery, the drone, still slaved to the watch's signal, corrected its gimbal. It didn't matter who was wearing the beacon. The machine only knew coordinates. "What did you do?" Dae-hyun's eyes widened. "I gave you exactly what you wanted," Quan Ho whispered. "The spotlight." The ceiling didn't just fall, it vanished. The missile strike was a localized thermobaric explosion, a sunbright flash that turned the air into fire. The shockwave tossed Zoraida toward the emergency exit. She hit the concrete hard, the air leaving her lungs in a painful rush. Through the ringing in her ears, she saw the refinery collapsing into a tomb of twisted steel and fire. She waited. For a minute, then 5. The sirens were screaming in the distance, a chorus of law and order coming too late to save anyone. A figure emerged from the smoke. He was limping, his flannel shirt burned away, his skin covered in the soot of his own empire. Quan Ho stopped in front of her. In his hand, he held a small, silver thumb drive, the physical backup of the ledger. "Marcus's name is on the first page," he said, his voice a ghost of a whisper. "The rest of it belongs to the world." He dropped the drive into her hand. "What will you do?" Zoraida asked, looking at the man who had lost everything. Quan Ho looked at the burning ruins, then at his bare wrist. For the first time in 20 years, he didn't have a schedule. He didn't have a kingdom. He didn't even have a name. "The ghost is dead, Zoraida," he said, turning toward the shadows of the river. "And the man is finally going to see what it's like to be invisible." By the time the first police cars reached the refinery, there was nothing left but the cooling embers and a girl standing in the rain, clutching the truth of 1,000 sins in the palm of her hand. The ghost of the Midwest had vanished, leaving only a legend and a ledger behind.